Well, welcome everyone. Thank you very much, Patrick, for that introduction. I understand people are tuning in from all parts of the world. A special welcome for those of you at the Sheraton Sabang. I understand you've got a big contingent there, so thank you for showing up. I'm in the dubious position of never having had a job. Now, I know for a lot of people that is an embarrassment. That's not something they want to advertise. But I'm happy about it. I've never had a job. I never want to have a job. And you know, it's a funny thing. People come up to me and say, Dolph, what's it like never having had a job? And I say, well, you know, that's a bit like me asking you, what's it like never having been to Pluto? You haven't been, so you don't know. I don't know what it's like having a job, but I don't want to find out, because the friends I've got who do have jobs, they assure me that there's always something funny going on. They don't like their employer, they don't like the people they work with, they don't like the hours, they don't like this, they don't like that. One of the beauties of not having a job is that you can determine every aspect of your life. If you want to sleep in till noon and work till 1 a.m., you can do that. If the next day you want to get up at 4 and watch the sunrise, you can do that too. And there's an element of freedom that you have by being your own boss that you cannot compare with anything else. So, I assume that a lot of you will want to have that freedom. The question is, how are you going to achieve it? Well, for me, I started in business at a very young age. I was 8 years old when I had a fruit stall on the beach in Australia. And I used to buy my product at 1 cent each, and I would sell it for 2 cents each. And I know it doesn't sound like there's much profit in there, but believe me, my profit margin was 100%. And on a good Saturday, I would sell 100 items and make $1 profit, which again doesn't sound like much, but bear in mind, back then my weekly allowance was 20 cents a week. So here I figured out a way where I could earn 5 times my weekly allowance in one day. I didn't want to do anything else. I thought I was in heaven. But anyway, fast forward a bit, because I came from a household from parents who had been through the Depression, they had been through the war. Their belief system was that to do well, really well, you need to study hard. Because by studying hard, you can get qualifications. And with a degree, you can get a good job. And with a good job, you can build a good career. And with a good career, you've got all the financial security that you could ever want. So it was very hard for me to break out of this mold. And in fact, I didn't at first. I dutifully went to university. Of course, I didn't know what I wanted to study, except I knew I didn't like the sight of blood. Still don't really. I didn't want to look in people's mouths all day. I wanted to study law, but you had to practice in the country in which you studied, and I liked the idea of being international. So slowly I eliminated medicine, I eliminated dentistry and law and a whole lot of other practices. And eventually I decided to do engineering. Well, that would have all been good and well, except for one problem. In my first year at engineering school, I realized that not many engineers were wealthy. In fact, many of them were what I would call on the poverty line. They wore shabby clothes, they drove around in old cars, and they had very modest homes. So I took it upon myself to make a study of the rich. I wanted to know, what is it that the rich have in common? And you know, the study took 8 months, and there were very few things that they had in common. It certainly wasn't age, it wasn't gender, it wasn't whether you were born into a rich family or not, it wasn't whether you were an immigrant, it wasn't whether your parents were entrepreneurs or not. In fact, the more I studied it, the more I came to conclude that the rich in general only had 2 things in common. The first of these is that almost without exception, the rich had integrity. In other words, their word was their honor. If they said they were going to do something, they did it. And I'm not here to suggest that if you don't have integrity, you cannot get rich. There are many mafia groups around the world who get fabulously rich, and it's debatable whether they have what we would call integrity. However, I do believe that if you don't have integrity, then the very mechanism by which you become wealthy, that will also be the cause of your undoing. So, that was the first thing. The second thing I noticed that the rich all had in common is that almost without exception, the rich either made their money in real estate or they held their wealth in real estate. And that was a big lesson for me, because I decided at the age of 17, for that reason, to get into real estate, to try and mimic and model those people that I thought were doing very well. Now, Believe me, when I was 17, I looked pretty young, and to get a mortgage back then was not an easy task. In fact, it was difficult. Of course, it was difficult for me to date someone because they all thought I was 12, but that's another story. So here I was, going to banks, trying to get mortgage funding on properties. However, it succeeded. And by the time I finished my degree, and by the way, I was at university for some 8 years. They say there are 3 kinds of students: part-time, full-time, and eternal. Well, I was the eternal kind. However, I persevered. Much to my parents' delight, I got this fabulous PhD in electrical engineering. And I'm sure that they were waiting for me to announce my acceptance of a job offer. I'm sure they were sitting there waiting by the telephone, giggling to each other, saying, I wonder which job offer he's going to accept. And of course I never did, for the following reason. When I finished my doctorate, I was offered a job at $32,000 a year. Now back then that was a lot of money, so it was a pretty good job offer. But the problem for me is that a week before I had just completed a real estate deal which was worth $35,000. And I remember thinking to myself, why would anyone in their right mind work for 40 hours a week for 49 weeks of the year, turning up every morning at 8 or 9 o'clock saying, hi boss, here I am, what would you like me to do today? When in 1 week you can make $35,000, a lot more than in the job, and take the rest of the year off. Or if you don't take the year off, you might do that 2, 3, 4 times over. So I never accepted a job. I got more and more into business, in particular into real estate. And it was only a couple of years ago, in fact, it was a bit more. I was in my mid-30s when I went to visit my parents in Europe. They came to pick me up at the airport. We were driving back to their home. And my parents looked at me and they said, you know, maybe you've done the right thing. And I remember thinking, wow, what a compliment. Not to me, but to their belief system that what they were doing was perhaps not the best thing in this day and age. But my answer to them was, I will know that you're really convinced when you can drop the word maybe from your sentence, maybe you've done the right thing. And I hope that in the years since then, they have come to accept that perhaps I am better off now than I would have been had I had a job. So what I want to do today is I want to give you a semblance of why I believe real estate is so good. Because the fact is, I don't think it's a little bit better than other things, or even a lot better than other things. My belief is that real estate is hundreds and hundreds of times better than other investments that you can get into. And the best way for me to illustrate why this is will be if you will give me the honor of being able to ask 4 questions. With these 4 questions, I will try and highlight to you why property is different from anything else you can invest in. So before we start, I want us to agree that we have to consider a lump of money that we want to invest. And it doesn't matter how much it is. It might be 5,000 ringgit or dollars or rupiah, anything. It might be 5 million. For the sake of this argument, let's consider a lump of cash of $100,000. And again, it doesn't really matter whether these are US dollars or Singaporean dollars that we're talking about. So we've got $100,000 to invest. And let's also, for the sake of this question session, ignore all brokerage fees and commissions. We're just going to talk in terms of a lump of money. So here we go, my 4 major questions as to why real estate is so good. Question number 1. Imagine you've got this lump of 100,000 cash and you want to buy stocks or shares with that money. The first question is, how many dollars worth of stocks can you buy with 100,000 cash? And I know many people think it's a trick question. Of course it's not. You can buy exactly $100,000 worth of stocks with 100,000 cash. Now I know there will be some Puritans amongst you who will say, well, hang on a minute, you can buy shares on margin, and that's true. But, you know, the complete story is that you can only get about 30% funding on shares that you buy on margin, and it only applies to about 30% of the shares on the market. For most investors in the stock market, when they buy X dollars worth of stock, they have put up X dollars in cash. So, just to recap, with 100,000 cash, you can generally buy $100,000 worth of stocks. Now, let's ask that same question with regard to real estate. If you have $100,000 cash, how many dollars worth of real estate can you buy with your 100,000 cash? And clearly you could buy $100,000 worth by paying cash, But because you can get a mortgage, you could also easily get $200,000 worth with a 50% mortgage, or $500,000 worth with an 80% mortgage. You're putting in 20% cash. In fact, it is relatively easy in the Western world to buy $1 million worth of real estate with $100,000 cash. Now, to do that, of course, you need a mortgage worth $900,000. And I know some of you are saying, $900,000? If you paid, say, 8% interest on that, the interest bill alone would be $72,000. That's more than I earn. How would I pay it? And the answer, of course, is very simple. You have an asset worth $1 million that is generating rental income. And that rental income, in general, will cover your mortgage outgoings and then some. So the first difference between real estate and anything else is, with most other things, when you buy the asset, you have to put up all the cash. With real estate, you do not have to put up all the cash. So let's move on to question number 2. Assume you've bought your $100,000 worth of stocks for $100,000 cash. Question 2 is, the day you bought your stocks, what are they worth? And again, some will say, that's a trick question. It's not. The day you buy your $100,000 worth of stocks, they are worth exactly $100,000. And the reason is that in any stock market, there is only one point at which willing buyers and willing sellers meet. That is why we have the stock market. And it doesn't matter whether you're trading in Singapore or in Frankfurt, London or New York, that whole market is unified in one exchange. And anyone who wants to buy or sell on that exchange does so at the one trading price that is valid at that time. In other words, you may think that the shares are worth a lot more, but you still have to only pay that same price. You may think they're worth a lot less, but if you want them, you have to pay that one price. Okay, question number 2 as it relates to real estate. The day you buy your $1 million worth of property for $100,000 cash and a $900,000 mortgage, how much is that property worth? And the temptation is to say, well, it must be worth $1 million. That's what the market bore. But the fact of the matter is that it is not necessarily worth $1 million. Let me give you some examples. Is it not possible that some fast-talking real estate agent talked you into buying this property when it's only worth $650,000 and you paid $1 million? Is that possible? You bet it is. It happens every day of the week. And by the same token, is it not possible that that property for which you contracted to pay $1 million using $100,000 cash and a $900,000 mortgage, is it not possible that that property is worth $1.5 million? And the answer is, of course it is. It happens every day of the week. And the problem is that if you don't believe that, you will not find them. If you don't believe it, you won't even see them when someone delivers one to you on a silver plate. And believe me, when you get into real estate, they will offer you those properties. Now, I can tell that some of you are thinking, why on earth would anyone in their right mind sell a property worth $1.5 million for a mere $1 million? And just to alleviate any fears that I might be telling a story, let me give you some examples. The most common one, unfortunately, is divorce, where a couple have been happily married. Of course they can discuss finances, ad infinitum if need be. But when they get to the divorce stage, they are at each other's throats. They don't communicate. They say, let's just sell the property and split the proceeds this week. Or someone may have contracted to buy another property to live in with a settlement or closing 3 months out, and they think that they've got 3 months to sell their property. It will sell no trouble at all. But 1 week before they have to pay the money for the other property, they still haven't sold theirs, and the price drops dramatically. Another example is 4 children might have been bequeathed a property, and they can't agree on what to do with it. One wants to live in it, one wants to sell it, the third wants to rent it out, and the fourth one, well, he's trekking in Nepal and they can't contact him. So the lawyers for the 4 people get together and they say, let's just sell the property and split the money and be done with it. There are 101 reasons, truly, why people will sell a property at below its true value. And if you look long and hard enough, you will find them. So the second difference, apart from the fact that you've got leverage to buy property, you don't need all the money, is that when you do buy a property, it may be worth a lot more than you're contracting to pay. That's pretty exciting. Let me, though, move on to question number 3. Question number 3 goes like this. Imagine you've used your $100,000 cash to buy $100,000 worth of shares, and the day you buy them, they're worth $100,000. What can you personally do to increase the value of those shares? And before you say, well, nothing or not much, let's be creative. Let's give stocks and shares their fair due. You could pray, for instance, or could you not write a letter to the directors of the company wishing them a good day? Or hey, how about going out and buying as many of the products and services as the companies you've invested in offer, so that that will increase their share value? And I know I'm being a little facetious. The fact of the matter is, once you've bought those shares or those stocks, there is almost nothing you can do to increase the value. Now let's compare that with real estate. The day you buy your $1.5 million property for a contract price of only $1 million, using only $100,000 cash and a $900,000 mortgage, what can you personally do to increase the value of that property? And ladies and gentlemen, the answers are so long, we could spend the next 3 hours just skimming the surface of what you can do. The simplest and fastest thing you can do is paint the building. I once bought a property on a Thursday for $60,000. I had it painted that weekend and sold it on Tuesday following, so not even a week later, for $80,000. Now I know some of you will think that's impossible or you can't do that where I am from. But again, if you don't believe these things exist, you will not find them. This little property was there, the paint was flaking off the weatherboards. I'm sure that a lot of other people thought, that horrible old little cottage, I bet not only is the paint rotten, but the plumbing's probably shot, the wiring needs redoing, the floorboards will be buckled, the piles will be rotting. Who would want to buy that? And the fact of the matter is, after I did it up, spending a mere $20,000, mere $400, it went up by 20. After doing it up, I'm sure people would drive by and say, what a fantastic little cottage, how cute, and look how freshly it's painted. I bet the floorboards are pretty good too, and the plumbing and the wiring. It's all to do with our psychology. So I made $20,000 that weekend. I'm sure you'll agree that was a good reward for my effort. But it gets better, ladies and gentlemen, because my effort didn't even involve me getting a paintbrush and doing the job. I got someone else to do that, because my time is better spent looking for the next great deal than it is doing up my existing deal. So anyway, except that there are so many things you can do. One of the projects I'm working on right now is writing a book called something like 101 Things You Can Do to Massively Increase the Value of Your Property Without Spending Much Money. So that's pretty exciting. But I said there were 4 questions. We've covered 3. And here is my 4th and final question to highlight the differences between real estate and other investments. Imagine you had that $100,000 lump of cash. You bought $100,000 worth of stocks. They were worth $100,000 when you bought them. You couldn't do much to increase their value. Let's assume, however, that through market forces, everything has doubled in value, because over time things do tend to go up, even if only through inflation. So your stock portfolio is now worth $200,000. Here is my 4th question. What do you have to do to capitalize on some of that increased value? What do you have to do to realize some of your profit? And I think you'll agree that in general, in order to get access to your profit, you have to sell some of your shares. Now there's nothing wrong with selling, except in some countries you then have to consider capital gains tax. And more importantly, when you sell the very thing that's supposed to be generating increased value for you, you're reducing the money you have at stake. You're doing the inverse of compound interest. You are taking away from what can grow. There seems to be something fundamentally wrong with decreasing the size of your investment. Now let's again compare that with real estate. Let's assume that it has also doubled. It's gone from $1.5 million to $3 million. My question therefore is, what do you personally have to do in order to reap some of the benefit of that increase in value? And a lot of people say, well, I guess you'll have to sell it. But you know, ladies and gentlemen, the fact of the matter is you don't have to do that at all. You can simply go back to the bank and say, you know that property I bought 5 years ago, or however long it was, remember how it was worth $1.5 million back then? Well, here's my latest registered valuation or appraisal. Today it is worth $3 million and I want to refinance it. I want to borrow a new loan. I want to take out a new mortgage. And if they give that same 90% loan value ratio, then that bank on your $3 million property will lend you $2.7 million. Now it's not yours to spend, because remember, the original mortgage was for $900,000. So when we pay off the $900,000 mortgage using our new $2.7 million mortgage, we are left with $1.8 million. That's pretty exciting. Now, the first question I would ask is that money taxable? It's a valid question, right? And think about it. Is it income? Have you earned it as a job type income? The answer is no. Have you sold anything? No, so there can be no talk of a capital gains tax. Did you sell something? Is there a GST or value-added tax involved? No. The fact is that money is yours to do with as you see fit. Of course, you have to pay interest on it. But if you use that money that you have left over, the $1.8 million, as a deposit on another lump of property, and again you get 90% gearing, then you can buy $18 million worth of property. You add that to the original $3 million, you now have $21 million worth. And I know when I do this in front of a crowd where I can get the feedback straight away, some of them are saying it can't be that good. And you know what? It may not always be, but it can be. You've got to change your psychology from it can't be to it can be. And here's my contention. Even if it's only half as good as what I've just said, that's still $10.5 million that you've created. Even if it's only 10% as good, that's still $2.1 million. Even if it's only 1% as good as the scenario I've just painted, it would still be $210,000, more than what you would have had if you had stocks and they doubled in value. So, you know, when I look at it in this light, in this cold light of day as to why property is so good, I cannot for the life of me understand why more people don't get into it. Now, of course, I have some reasons why they don't. One of the biggest reasons is that in general, the media is against real estate. And the reason why they're against real estate is they're not inherently against property, but the media exists to sell headlines. If they don't have good, catchy headlines, they won't sell newspapers and news reports. People like sensationalism and hot topics and steamy topics. That's why the tabloids work so well. So imagine if someone says there's been a major downturn in the property market, or this project is not doing well, that catches headlines. But they have never published one of my headlines, and I don't take it personally. It's simply because my headline in the newspapers today would be the same as it would have been yesterday, or last week, or last month, or 10 years ago, which is, Dolph Duru states, go out and buy property because in 10 years' time you'll be really pleased you did. My message doesn't change. And that is why, from the newspaper's perspective, it's boring. It does not sell newspapers. However, that of itself does not necessarily make it incorrect. And I remember one of the headlines that I read in a newspaper was, people owning houses as investments will be better off in 20 years' time if they sell those properties now and put the money in the bank. I mean, there is a catchy headline. And my staff wrote a press release, which I penned, denouncing this and trying to counter it. No newspaper wanted to pick up on it. I was sitting in a taxi going to the airport when the driver asked me, what have you got in the boxes in the back of the car? And I said, well, they happen to be books. He said, oh, really? What are the books on? And I said, they're on real estate. He said, oh, you know a bit about that, do you? I said, well, not really. He said, well, tell me. I read that report that said properties were going to go down over the next 20 years. So I sold my house. Do you think I did the right thing? Well, all I can tell you is that I gave him an extra large tip because I figured he'd need it. Now, 3 months later, the same quasi-government organization that had made this prediction, they had another headline-grabbing announcement. Economic circumstances have changed. It's once more viable to buy real estate. And I think you'll see my point. Some people make their money by selling advice or writing articles, and others make their money by doing things. So one piece of advice I'd like to give you is, if ever anyone offers you any advice on anything to do with money, ask yourself, does this person make the bulk of his or her income by doing exactly the same thing that they're asking me to do? Or does this person make the bulk of his or her income by selling advice, by getting me to do something, but they don't do it, they just make money by getting me to do it? The answer to that question, ladies and gentlemen, will tell you how much credence to give your advisors. So, I look at it in another way. Imagine you go to your bank manager and you say, Mr. or Mrs. Bank Manager, I really want to buy some paintings because I think they're going to go up in value. And my neighbors think platinum is a good investment. And my cousin, he's into gold. And my wife, well, she likes antiques. So will you please lend me some money so that I can go and buy these things? You and I both know that the bank manager will laugh you out of their office. Whereas all over the world, whether you look at billboards or newspaper advertisements or TV advertisements, whatever, on the radio, banks are falling over themselves to give you money to buy property. And that tells you two things about property. Firstly, it's still a very safe and secure investment. And secondly, as we've already seen, you don't even need the money to buy it. One of the most common questions I get is, that's a bold claim, you don't need the money to buy it. How can you possibly buy property without having any money? And the answer to that is easy. I do it all the time. I will go one step further. It is possible to buy property, own the property, and end up with money in your pocket. Now let me explain how that might work. Firstly, let's talk some numbers. Let's say you see a property that's on the market at $300,000. Now, if you've done your research and found out that that property is truly worth $400, by the way, why would they sell it for $300 if it's worth $400? We've explained some of those reasons already. Another one is they might be too stingy or cheap to engage the services of a valuer. They think they can save $1,000 by not paying a professional, and in actual fact, they don't know the value. So anyway, it's on the market at $300. What's to stop you buying it and getting a mortgage based on the valuation of $400? Well, I know in some countries banks say that they will lend based on the lesser of the valuation or the purchase price. So if the purchase price is only $300, that's what they use as collateral. Well, there are ways around that. For instance, in your contract to buy this property, you could say, let's have deferred settlement, delayed closing, whatever you want to call it. You sign the contract now, but you will transact the deal in 3 months' time. And what's more, you put in that contract that you have the right of access. That means you can go in there to do things to the property. Now, you might go in there and paint it, put new guttering on the outside, put a new carpet in, seal the driveway, put up a new fence, pull down an old fence, put a shed on the property, whatever. It doesn't really matter. Because at the end of 3 months, you commission a new valuation and you go back to the bank and you own up to the bank and say, look, I know I'm only paying $300,000 for this property, but that was then and this is now. The fact of the matter is that I've gone in and I've done things to that property. It is a different property today. What's more, the market has moved somewhat. Here is a current valuation. This is what the property is currently worth. And I want to get a mortgage based on the valuation. 9 out of 10 banks will agree with you because remember, banks want to give you money. That's why they run all those advertisements. That's why you don't have to go and beg for money to buy property. They come to you. All right. So we've seen that you can get this money to buy the property. If you get an 80% mortgage based on a $400,000 valuation, then you've got $320,000. You only paid $300 for it, so you can put $20,000 in your pocket. Again, no tax obligations attached. There are many other ways. Let me give you one more because I realize we've got a limited time. If I weren't given a limit, I'd talk all day just on how to buy money with no money, how to buy properties with no money down. You see how excited I get about it. Here we go. The second way, and people forget about this, is why not ask the seller or the vendor if he'll leave some money in? You see, you don't know anything about their circumstances. They might be retiring and going into a smaller home because they don't want to look after a big home. And their biggest headache when they sell this property is going to be, what do I do with my money? How do I invest it? Well, you're offering them an investment. You're saying, I'll buy your $300,000 property, but I would like you to leave $100,000 in at 5% interest or whatever you can negotiate for 5 years. That might be the best deal he's had all week. He might do it. If you don't ask, you can be sure that they won't say yes. No, you've got, but yes, you might get. So once again, you might get a mortgage from the bank for $250,000. You get $100,000 of vendor finance. You've got money in your pocket. Now, if that's stretching your comfort zone too much, this money in your pocket, but fine, just do the deal so that it doesn't cost you any. then you get a philosophical question. If you can buy a property by signing a few contracts, namely the purchase agreement and the mortgage agreement, it doesn't cost you any money, but you get positive cash flow coming out of that property that's indexed for inflation, and the value of that property keeps on going up. My question would have to be, why would you not do that? This deal sounds so good, why would you not do it? So I think you'll agree that real estate has some unique attributes. It's got some aspects to it which sets it apart from any other investment vehicle. Of course, there are many more. You can use the psychology in property the way you can't in anything else. Let me give you one brief example. This is my favorite way of buying a property. Normally when you buy a property, you have to write up a contract. And that contract may be a standard form that you use in your country. However, in just about every property market in the world, there is nothing at all to stop you from adding clauses or even writing your own contract on the back of a cigarette packet or an envelope. There's nothing to stop you doing that. So you can put things in that contract that you couldn't put in other contracts for other deals. But here's what I suggest. When you write out your offer, why not write a check for the deposit amount and staple it to the contract? You know, legally it doesn't change anything, because if the seller doesn't countersign your offer, he can't bank your check. And if he does countersign the offer, you'd have to pay him the money anyway, so you're no better off, you're no worse off. But psychologically, when you have that check stapled to the contract and the seller sees it, he thinks to himself or herself, if I sign this contract and accept the offer, I can bank this check. Now that's pretty powerful. So that is one of the many, many things you can do to make sure the deal goes your way. Well, I've spoken for quite a bit now on why I think real estate is so good. So what I'd like to do now, because I want this to be a session for you rather than by me, is I want to open it up to some questions that we've had coming in, and hopefully I'll be able to give you some answers to those questions. And I'm going to take a brief moment to take a sip. All right, our first question comes from Sun in Malaysia, and it is, how do I prepare myself to deal and handle with 6 or 7 digits when I can only earn US dollars, okay, per annum, or US 10K per annum? Okay, so the question, just to paraphrase it, let's say you're on an income of only $10,000 per annum. How can you get yourself to psychologically deal with 6 or 7 digits? Well, we've touched on that already. I've shown you how with a cash investment of some $100,000, you can pretty rapidly end up with 21 million. And let me give you some other clues. Firstly, the number of zeros behind a deal doesn't matter. Do you think that we all go around talking about a $21 million deal, or a $14 million mortgage, or a $200 million deal? It's too many syllables. You just say, well, this one's costing 21. It's shorter. Forget about the zeros. The second thing I'd say is this. When you do a deal, it requires about the same amount of effort, whether it's a $100,000 deal or a $1 million deal. The amount of effort required for a $1 million deal is about the same as for a $10 or a $100 million deal. So which would you rather do? One $100 million deal or 100 $1 million deals? That's the second thing. The third thing is, if you can't get used to big numbers, then you're going to be stuck in that paradigm. And I'm not being hard on you, because you've already made the right step. You've made the first step to recognize the problem. If we don't believe there's a problem, if we think, well, I'll never deal with 6-digit numbers anyway, then subconsciously you are limiting yourself to those small deals. I would say maybe you should take a risk and give up the $10,000 per annum. Maybe you should quit working and find a good deal that will put money in your pocket. And I know that's scary. So as an intermediate step, why not spend every weekend for the next 3 months looking for a great deal? You'll be surprised what you find. Thank you for that question. The next question is from John in Australia. The property market is subjected to cycles. Does it mean we have to wait for the right opportune low season to buy and then sell it when it increases in price? Well, my answer to that, John, is an emphatic no, no, no. Firstly, I don't know if it really does go in cycles. People talk about a 7-year cycle, but I wouldn't like to decide now where we are in that cycle and agree to buy or sell, as the case may be, in 7 years' time. Secondly, we're living in this fabulous big world, And if Australia is in a bit of a down part of the cycle right now, I can promise you there are other parts of the world that are in an up cycle. Why not go and buy properties there? I mean, I know there are difficulties associated with that. For instance, you'd have to travel and go to exotic places and do the very things that people spend a lot of holiday time and money on to get there. And by the way, if you travel to exotic locations to do real estate deals, do you think your travel is tax deductible? Of course it is, because it's used to generate income. And thirdly, John, you said, should you wait until the market is up again before you sell? Well, here's a contention I'll make, and it will not sit well with a lot of you, and that is never sell. Why would you ever sell a property? Remember, you don't need to sell to make your money. You can make money by having it double in value or go up by 10% for the matter, and go back to the bank and refinance. You've gone from 100,000 purchase price to 200,000 value. You could sell and make $100,000 profit, but what are you going to do with that profit? You'll just buy another property. So why not keep the one you've got, pull more money out and buy a second one, and then when everything doubles in value, you would have had both properties go up in value. So thank you, John. Here is a question from James in Singapore. What is your strategy during a sideways or channel market? Well, thank you. I don't want to be cute here, but if there is a channel market in Singapore, go to another channel like the English channel. Go and check out real estate in the UK. Check it out in France, Belgium, Holland, Denmark, Finland. Even if you don't buy anything on your first trip, what a hoot you'll have going there looking at the properties. You never learn less, so you'll always find other places where you can invest. Now, having said that, even if there is a sideways market, in other words, it's at a plateau, it's not going anywhere, do you think it's possible that you can still find bargains? Of course, because when the market's going up, and the inference is that's when you want to be buying, then everyone else thinks it's going up. It'll be hard to find spectacular deals. When the market's sort of drifting, there'll be people getting desperate to sell. And if you just keep your ear to the ground and keep looking and looking and looking at properties, you will find spectacular deals out there. So keep looking, keep expecting a good deal to happen, and if you don't find one where you live, go somewhere else. Thank you. Here's our next question. It comes from Lisa in Malaysia. What is your recommendation for the minimum return on investment from property investment before you sell? Well, I see we've got a recurring theme here, before you sell. And again, I just want to emphasize my recommendation is that unless there are extenuating circumstances, never sell. People who sell always regret it. People who don't sell, be it by design or just they never got around to it, they are always so thankful. Even when the London market crashed in the mid-80s and people were what they call upside down, which means that they owed more on their mortgage than they had left value in their properties, even that has turned around again, and those who hung on to their properties are now not only into a positive situation where the properties are worth more than the mortgages, but they're worth more than they were at the previous peak. So to get back to the first part of your question, Lisa, what sort of minimum rate of return should you expect? You know, this is really a topic that I spend at least 3 hours on at my property investors' schools, because we've all been led to believe that the index to use is the yield. Now, when you have 100,000 in the bank and you're earning 6,000 income, your yield is truly 6%, and it's accurate. But if you buy a $100,000 property and your rental income is 6,000, then the yield by definition is 6%, but it doesn't mean anything because you're not putting up 100,000. You might only put up $10,000. Of itself, that would mean your yield is 60%. But remember, now we've got mortgage interest, you've got other expenses, so we need more than the yield. A better measure is the cash-on-cash return, but an even better one, and that's what we get the software to do, is the internal rate of return. If the cash-on-cash return is a snapshot impression of how that property is doing, the internal rate of return is the video to see into the future, and that's what I want to do. Now, I know I haven't answered your question. It depends. It depends on the market. Sometimes you expect a lower cash flow return, but you expect a higher capital growth, and other times you want high cash flow return, but lower capital growth. You decide what's right for you, and then you go forward. Thank you for that question. Our next question is from Raymond in Singapore. How do you manage risk? Can you suggest some foolproof merchandise? Ooh. I'm not sure what you mean by merchandise here. For me, because I'm so property oriented, I want to talk about real estate merchandise. What sort of real estate can you buy that's foolproof? Well, for me, one of the most foolproof pieces of property you can buy is one that has a long-term lease to the government. Because if the government's not going to pay the lease rental, then the whole country's in trouble. So a government lease is almost a certainty. It's a guarantee to have that rental income come in all the time. Another way to sort of make yourself immune to a downturn in the market is to spread your risk. Now, I know some people want you to spread your risk by having 5% in real estate, 5% in stocks, 5% in mutual funds, 5% in options, 5% in hedge contracts, 5% in commodities, 5% under your mattress, 5% in the bank. I think if you spread your risks that ridiculously widely, you're not going to be an expert at anything. I would rather do what Mark Twain said, which is put all your eggs in one basket and then watch that basket very well. Now, having said that, there are many things you can do to diversify within real estate. For instance, you could buy some residential, some commercial, some industrial, and some hospitality property. You could buy some new stock, you could buy some old stock. You could buy some, as I said before, in good areas where you get good capital growth but lower yields, and other stock in other areas where you get the other way around, high yields and low capital growth. You could spread your risks internationally. There is nothing to stop anyone getting on a plane and going to countries that welcome investors. And if you do that, you introduce the risk of the exchange rate, but it can also be a benefit to you. In other words, if your local currency goes down, then where you have those investments overseas might have gone up in your own currency, even if they haven't moved at all. For instance, an Indonesian who might have invested 5 years ago in a foreign country, he would be very happy that he did so, I imagine. So there are many ways of spreading your risks that I think are worth considering. And one of the great things about property is the market is always evolving. There's always something new happening that if you learn how to make those adjustments and go with the flow, change with the times, you can be one step ahead of the competition, because the market out there is very, very slow. One thing we're working on at the moment, as in many cities around the world, is we are focusing on student accommodation. In some countries, New Zealand as an example, there's not much growth in the economy, there's not much growth in many sectors, but there is massive growth in student numbers. They all need to live somewhere. What's more, their expectations of quality of accommodation is going up. So whereas 10 years ago they might have lived in an old house that was divided into 5 or 6 units for students to live in, an old dilapidated house, now they want something more upmarket. We are providing fabulous accommodation. We provide free broadband internet connections, free nationwide toll calls or long distance calls, all thrown in, and these are very highly in demand. So when you keep tabs on the market, you can always do very well. Well, I want to thank you all for asking the questions. I hope this has been of some benefit to you. I've just got to tell you, I love this game. I'm a bit like a 5-year-old kid who wakes up in the morning. You know how a kid never sleeps, and not a 5-year-old. Have you ever heard of a 5-year-old that you have to wake at noon and say, come on, you lazy so-and-so, get up? A 5-year-old gets up out of bed, wants to know, why is the sky blue? Why is the grass green? What are we going to do today? Let's go to the zoo. Will the panda's still there? They're just non-stop. I feel a little bit like that. I get up in the morning and I think, gee, I want to go and look at some property, because I know that out there somewhere is a deal waiting to be made, and what's more, the banks are willing to give me the money to buy it. I'm in heaven. Thank you very much. Thank you.